Hi everyone, this is Marcus Fayers, founder and editor-in-chief of Dezeen, and I'm here to introduce the first session of the Exhibit Columbus 2020 Symposium. Exhibit Columbus this year are doing a series of events, a series of online talks and discussions and symposia about new middles, which explores the middle of the United States, the Midwest, mid-sized towns, including Columbus, Indiana itself, where Exhibit Columbus is based, and they're looking at how design can improve these cities, can change these cities, transform these cities through the lens of several different topics. Today, we're talking about new middles, futures, and technologies. How can future gazing, futurology, technology, the discipline of looking forward and strategizing through research into the future, how can those lessons be applied to these types of cities? Speakers today are Dan Hill, who's head of strategic design at Vinnova. Hi there, Dan.
Hello, just unmute myself. Hello.
Hey, how are you?
Very well, thank you. How are you?
I'm good. And where are you? Are you actually in a forest?
Not literally, although there's one a few hundred meters away. I'm in a basement in Stockholm, and I'm sparing you my messy basement by putting this virtual background on. So yeah, I'm in Sweden.
I'm in the office in London, but I've got a backdrop that makes me look like I'm in a basement. So there we are. Yeah. Tell us a little bit about yourself. What do you do, and why are you in Sweden?
Yeah, so I'm in Sweden. I now work for the Swedish government's innovation agency. I'm a director of strategic design. And we're responsible for innovation and research in the country, basically coordinating the innovation systems, the universities, the research, the design that goes on in Sweden to some extent, making sure it's fit for purpose, basically. And my job as a designer is to look ahead a little bit and figure out what kind of techniques or practices or skills or new approaches we need to do that, to face the kind of challenges that we're all facing now. So yeah, that's what I do. In a sense, I'm a bureaucrat now, but still a designer deep down underneath that.
And traditionally, well, in my view anyway, the world of design and the world of bureaucracy don't tend to be particularly happy bedfellows. How do you bring together the kind of intuitive skills of design and the kind of I would imagine rather inflexible bureaucracy of a country or a city? How do you manage to make change happen?
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's it. It can seem inflexible, that bureaucracy needn't be, or let's just say government or governance, or the way that we decide to do things together, the way we make shared decisions about shared things, cities, infrastructures, places, policies, whether it's taxation or childcare or climate resilience and so on. All of those things are malleable. And government and public sector, municipal or national or regional level, makes decisions about those things every day. And design, as you know, Marcus, very well, design is about making decisions. So it's one of the skills that we can do. So design's role really to integrate things, to visualize things, to propose and provoke, to synthesize different elements together, to be a connector between things. All of the things we do when we're making a chair or a building or a website, those also apply, I would argue, in these broader contexts of governance and public sector. So as the way your question was put, it's not easy. They're not natural bedfellows, but I think when people see what design can do, or when you put it into action a little bit, it seems like it's a missing component often in government, and that's very powerful. I think now we can start bringing it in.
And Sweden has this innovation agency where you're employed, but how common is it for governments to engage with designers at this kind of level? Do all countries do that at some kind of degree, or is it quite unusual still?
So I think it's relatively unusual. There's sort of a bunch of us, almost like in a secret society of WhatsApp channels and things, where we hold each other's hand, and cry on each other's shoulder. But then, yeah, design in government, has a long history. Whether it's like, as you know, in the 70s, architecture in the UK, half the architects in the country worked in the public sector, worked in municipal planning and architecture teams. We've lost that now. It's less than 1% in the UK. So it's a kind of a muscle memory that we've lost, really. On the digital side, you can see now there's hundreds of designers employed in government delivering digital systems, but often not so much on the other stuff, like social services or buildings and cities and so on. So yeah, I think there's kind of always been a history there, and it's waxed and waned. It's coming back, I think, because it has something to offer, particularly to complex challenges. But yeah, I'm not that common. Most people have done political science or economics, or they're experts in a certain area of technology or something.
Okay, we'll come back to you in a minute, Dan, because you've prepared a little presentation about your work. But our second speaker today, going over to Oakland, California now, is Radha Mistry, leader of Foresight practice at Autodesk. Hi, Radha.
Hi, thank you for having me today.
You're very welcome. And how are things in California right now? We've been seeing some fairly apocalyptic scenes recently with the fires and everything. How's that going?
No, it's still going. It felt quite apocalyptic last week, but the sun's been out and I can see a bit of sky right now from my home office. So it's not as bad, but yeah, definitely still have some wildfires going. Absolutely.
So tell us a little bit about what you do.
Yeah, so my team is nested within the Autodesk CTO office, and we work with our executive leadership to really think about how is the world changing over the next 10 years? How will that influence the way that people design things and make things? And what does that mean for the way that our tools have to evolve to meet those needs? So we're really kind of going beyond our technological kind of comfort zone and making, explicit our assumptions around the way society, economies, politics, and the environment will evolve over time.
So in a way, I guess you're doing a similar thing that Dan's doing, but in the private sector rather than the public sector.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, we are very much impacted by decisions that are made in the public sector, and especially from kind of a governance perspective. And as a technology company, we do have some role and responsibility in helping to kind of ensure that the tools and the tech that we put out there are, well thought out and kind of critically placed and meet the needs and expectations of our customers. And so it's something that we take really seriously, and that and that's why we have a Foresight team to really be thinking about what's ahead of us and how can we ensure that we're not kind of just putting blinders on.
And you and Dan both worked, well, I'm not sure whether together, but for the same company, you both worked at Arup in the Foresight division there some time back. Did you work together, and what kind of things were you both doing then?
We worked in the same kind of realm. I was in London and then San Francisco, but it was really thinking about the drivers that would impact built environment and what that would mean across the various sectors that we operated in. So one day we were thinking about the future of retail, or the campus of the future, or the future of aviation. But it was, again, similarly to what I'm doing now at Autodesk, really focusing on how will the nature of design change over time, and what does that mean for these futures that Arup as a company was really helping to build in their infrastructure projects and their buildings projects out in the world.
And hopefully this will come up later on in the discussion, but in your view, rather, how much interface, or in your experience, how much interface is there between the private sector and the public sector? How often do you get to talk to government? Do the two sectors see themselves as adversaries, or do they work together for the common good? How does that work?
I don't think we could do what we do if we didn't have healthy relationships with the public sector. And we internally have a team that is focused purely on nurturing that relationship with government. But a lot of our partnerships, a lot of our projects, a lot of our research is really focused on building healthy relationships with government, with public sector, and then even more broadly with academia and with other industry partners as well. So it's a broad spectrum, and we don't see ourselves as kind of in it alone. And I think our success or failure relies very heavily on how much support and how good we are at cultivating those relationships.
And we're certainly starting to hear a lot of discussion now about how technology companies are starting to get involved in city making, and Sidewalk Labs is a good example. Maybe we can talk about that a bit later. But first, before you both give your presentations, I'm going to talk a little bit more about Exhibit Columbus. I'm going to actually read out the briefing notes they've given me, because it sets the scene for the whole series of discussions that they're doing, some of which will be taking place on Dezeen. So the 2020 symposium is called New Middles. Exhibit Columbus is a program of the landmark Columbus Foundation. It creates a 2-year cycle of programming that activates the design legacy of Columbus, Indiana, through symposia and a free public exhibition. This cycle of Exhibit Columbus asks international leaders in architecture and design to consider the question, what is the future of the middle city? Before we begin, let's take a moment to reflect on the long history of a city named for Christopher Columbus in a state named for Indians. The land where Columbus, Indiana is located was ceded to the United States in 1818 through the Treaty of St. Mary's. Yet this place has been a site of human activity for more than 12,000 years through the rich and vibrant cultures of the Adena, Hopewell, Cahokia, Shawnee, Miami, Kickapoo, and Delaware nations. We recognize that the languages, cultures, and traditions of these nations continue to this day. Although we are gathering virtually, we remain entwined by land, water, and soil. The conversation today features futurists Dan Hill and Radha Mistry, who will discuss the use of strategic foresight and storytelling in design. Each of our guests will give a short presentation, and then we'll follow up with a discussion and some questions from our audience. And those of you who are watching can ask questions through Facebook, which will then be relayed to me, and YouTube as well. The topic today asks the questions: what new normal realities from education and equity to mobility and manufacturing will shape what's next? Whose voices are represented? How might we extrapolate emergent technologies and contemporary conditions facing the Midwest into a speculative future of the middle? And of course, the Exhibit Columbus is based in Midwestern USA, but I'm sure there are middle cities everywhere that we can talk about. Certainly in my country, I know that there's a lot of cities that feel like they've been left behind. Dan, do you want to start us off then by firing up your presentation?
Sure. Just give me a second. Okay, can you see my screen?
I can, yeah.
Great. Okay, so thank you. Thanks for inviting me. So yeah, I'm going to talk a bit about, I'm going to end with a little bit about Sweden, but I'm just going to race through a little bit of the work that we do here, but also work that I've done before around this question of, I think the introduction put it quite nicely, this kind of strategic foresight, design, storytelling, and so on. Just thought I'd pick up my title there, and I often get asked, you know, what kind of designer are you, as Marcus just did. And people say, are you one of those futurists? And I'm sort of, I always resist the term hugely, because it implies that you're sort of looking into a crystal ball or something. And I just usually say, well, you know, all design is in the future, almost by definition. Like, you know, we're making something happen in a sense that hasn't happened yet, and making it hopefully preferred conditions, or whatever Victor Papanek quote you want to choose from. But the question is then, is it next week, or are we making something for next year, or is it in 10 years' time? Those are questions we can talk about, but it's all in the future one way or another. So I think there's this kind of tension right away. So let me explore what that might mean in practice. So here's a typical quote that, you know, one of the things I have to deal with often in my work. This is not my work. This is Dezeen in Paris. I don't work for Jean-Louis Misca. But he said something interesting in 2017. He said, we should announce before 2020 that in Paris, privately owned autonomous vehicles, that's the AV he's referring to, will not be allowed, essentially. It's only mobility as a service, not mobility as ownership. So you can only have public autonomous vehicles or self-driving vehicles. We can't have Marcus having a private Tesla, for instance, driving itself into Paris. That isn't what Parisians want. And I thought this was really interesting, because he's sort of saying, okay, we need to decide as Parisians how Paris moves around, and then we can talk to Mercedes-Benz or BMW or Tesla and so on. But then, of course, there's the huge question about, so what on earth does that mean? How's that going to work? Are you going to build a wall around Paris to keep the private autonomous vehicles out? Are you going to charge them when they come in? As a designer, our job is to sort of take that statement and then figure out how on earth could that happen in a way that's equitable and sustainable and so on. So work we did at the time, I just run this video. We used these videos, very quick videos, We made this in 2 or 3 days. That's my old watch. That in the background is the wall at Arup. This is the team I used to run at Arup. And we're just beginning to speculate how Anna, in this case, this person here, would call an autonomous vehicle. How do you make it come to her if it's a self-driving bus? And then you figure out eventually, long story short, you need something a bit like a bus stop. Surprise, surprise. It can't be just sort of buses everywhere as per Uber. It would just be chaos. So we're just beginning to use this video as a kind of sketching material to explore. Sorry for the terrible acting of my team at the time. That's not why they were employed. But as a kind of sketch material to reveal the latent questions within it, which are, will Anna trade off time against money? Will she share a small vehicle with strangers? How does it interplay with the public transport network? Up and down this scale of influence, there's kind of tons of questions embedded. And this is just one bit of Jean-Louis Miska's statement, like how on earth is it going to happen in terms of catching one? Then there's how would the street feel if you had autonomous vehicles driving away everywhere? And this we might use storytelling in a different way. This is Sydney in 1906. This is George Street, as in pre-car Sydney. And you see it's beautifully fluid. There's just this constant wave of movement, people are moving across the street. The sidewalk or the pavement is just a suggestion, really. It's basically massively encouraged jaywalking, which is my favorite kind of jaywalking. And constant trams in all directions, horses and everything, but everything just flows. It sort of actually feels rather beautiful, like Jane Jacobs would say, the ballet of the street. And so there's something in there again also in Jean-Louis' statement. So we're trying to understand, to borrow Cedric Price's quote from 1966, if technology is the answer, autonomous vehicles in this case, what was the question behind it? What kind of city do we want? How do we want the street to be? So this is when we need then different ways of articulating that. And this is when I was working on a project in Melbourne, the Innovation District in Melbourne. And we were looking at a street like this and thinking, well, how can this actually be a street, not just a big parking lot, which it is now? This is Melbourne CBD behind it. It's really super valuable space. It's just being used for parking. I mean, it's really an awful use of space, but you can't just kind of snap your fingers and say, okay, let's switch it to something else, get Radha to draw a nice picture of what it could be. Any one of us could do that, but it's kind of, how do you get there? So we start breaking it into pieces and saying, okay, we start gathering some data on what's happening in the street. You have to do that in a way which is public and fully respecting privacy. So the municipality probably needs to do that, and it probably needs to have this data has been collected by Dan. You can call him on this number. This is what he's collecting and why. Then we can shuffle the cars to the left and paint a bike lane in on the right. We're just testing here, really. So you could paint this bike lane in. We deliberately drew the cyclist without a helmet because that's against the law in Australia. And so we wanted to flush out that conversation about whether you could get the street safe enough not to wear a helmet. All of these assumptions can start coming out using speculation in this way. Little autonomous shuttle on the left here, we'll say we'll start testing that at that point. That might or might not work. So we need to be able to pivot in the language of tech away from that. So you still want to keep the infrastructure very light, things you can remove and back out of if they're not the right thing. Again, borrowed planting, this is now beginning to really change the environment a bit. You can see all changing mobility patterns here. You can still drive down this street though. So we're kind of able to hold a conversation with the car drivers and the pedestrians and the cyclists, and if you like, the new characters in the street here as well, until you can make this big move, which is the resurfacing of this nice Melbourne bluestone. And you can start seeing, actually, okay, this is a very different street environment. And even at this stage, we can speculate about the value that might produce, increased air quality, better stormwater mitigation, increased social fabric, kids playing in the street, business rates go up, accidents go down, healthcare savings start happening, all of those things could happen. But again, that's the easy bit in a way, drawing the end state. This is totally what planning and architecture processes ask you to do. Give us the end state. Tell us how much concrete you're going to need. Promise it'll be like this in 8 years when you've done it, or 7 years, or 6 years. And I just don't believe in that. I don't believe in that kind of planning. I don't think it's possible. I think there's too many uncertainties. It's too ambiguous, and you can't take advantage of technology as you go, and you can't bring people with you as you go. Because you can't just take these cars away like this. If I try and take these cars away in Melbourne just like that, these people will try and kill me. In Australia in particular, almost literally try and kill me. So you have to break it into this kind of wiggly, agile movement and adapt as you go. And that enables you to start small, start with the painted bike lane, and begin to wiggle your way towards the future, holding a conversation with the participants with you as you go. It gives you agility, you can adapt and adopt and so on. So what came out of that was actually, you start using different materials, actually start using different design elements. These are kind of a plug and play set of components that we designed to enable this. And then we worked with Breathe Architecture in Melbourne, who are fantastic architecture firm. They eventually made, you can see those little modules in the middle there for Melbourne University, a series of these that float across the campus as these sort of more malleable elements. You begin to put them in parking spaces and so on. So that's the end result of this bit. So then finally, I'll just talk about what now in Sweden, taking these same principles of agility and adoption and participation and breaking things down into small steps and sort of figuring out the future as you go. So we're working on a mission in Sweden now to which my team have started working across the public sector on, and then also with the private sector, transform every street in Sweden to be healthy, sustainable, and vibrant. And you might think actually Swedish streets already are like that. I can tell you they're not at all. They're one of the most car-dense countries in Europe and have been since the 50s, actually. So we have a lot of work to do. It's not bad, but it's a lot of work to do. We can't say they're healthy and sustainable. So we're working through then, where we as a team are then facilitating these discussions. We're kind of pulling the system into the room to get the starting points figured out. And here you can see people from car companies, from scooter companies, but also air quality experts from universities, high school students and others. We cast the net fairly wide there just to figure out the starting points. We use narrative as part of that process. Sometimes I'll write a short story kind of set in the near future, only 2-3 years out, but so not, jetpacks and Blade Runner, but certainly pushed forward a little bit. So there's a sense of possibility. And then we get people to finish the story themselves in the workshop, and we discuss that through just as a simple process. We get them to draw a lot. We make elements for them to begin to speculate with, and often we're just with pen and paper. We can also do it with other kinds of tech, but pen and paper are super malleable in this way. And then in the end, what we ended up doing was having got those insights as to where to start, we actually threw the real planning process over to school children. So what we're working with now is we've started working in 4 schools in Stockholm and the streets around those schools, and who better to design those streets than the school kids themselves. So again, using exactly the same materials that we work with the experts, I'd argue we've given it the real experts, which are the school kids in this case, they've come up with the same kind of process. We've done the same with the Prime Minister, by the way. That's the Swedish Prime Minister, doing the same kind of technique. I won't tell you who was better, the Prime Minister or the kids, but this is what the kids come up with. Of course, they come up with fake palms and gyms and things like this, and they're really beautiful, actually. And we then get architects and planners to translate those into deliverable things, and we've built a set of components that can then begin to occupy multiple parking spaces, like an elongated boardwalk, working with industrial designers and architects here. And these are the 4 streets we're working on in the next week. And then we're working across now multiple municipalities to actually shift all of them if we can. So the end of this then is about who's deciding what the future of the street is. Well, the street itself in this case. We're coming up with a model whereby it's not planned by planners in this sense, or designers or architects. They're facilitating and helping with that process. But the street itself, the residents and the users of the street are deciding what kind of kit goes in there. And I like this quote from Saskia Sassen about the street. It's a place in which new forms of the social and the political can appear. We've seen that obviously most recently with COVID clearing the streets and throwing up another idea in people's heads about what streets can be about. You see that with Black Lives Matter, of course, playing out in the streets, because that's where politics happens most viscerally and most powerfully. But in very simple, small ways. This is a lovely installation by Linda Tegg, the Australian artist, at ArcDes in Stockholm, called Infield. And it's just a meadow. It's like a modular meadow that begins to spread out and claim this car park. And it asks the question about what is greenery and biodiversity in public space? Can it have this kind of very diverse form? And they said they're all about shifting our mental models about what the street is for. So I'll end with a couple of quotes. One from Nikita Oliver, who's a mayoral candidate in Seattle. It's, talking about, it's one thing to take the space. This is obviously in the context of Black Lives Matter, but it's another thing to turn the space into something functional that serves the community. And we're arguing the best way to do that is, of course, with the community themselves. If they are the ones actually figuring this out in conjunction with us as the government or as so-called experts, that's very powerful. So I'm interested in this 1 minute, 15-minute city interplay, the interplay between the street and the city. And we can put all of these things on there, these nice words: regenerative, biodiverse landscapes, conviviality, and so on. Those are the things the street can be about. But really the key bit is the last bit: designing the conditions for shared ownership of the city and its futures. That's what we're trying to do. It changes governance practice completely, as you can imagine, totally changes the way we think about things like planning and design and architecture. But I'd argue it's far more engaged. It's likely to be opening up new possibilities for futures. It's a model that's got diversity built into it because you're building it with the people who are actually there, and they are as diverse or not as that street is. So it's not me deciding, it's them. So I think I'll leave it at that. That's what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thanks, Dan. You gave the examples of Melbourne and Stockholm there, but are these approaches, these lessons equally valid in smaller cities like in the Midwest of America or in Northern England or in different parts of Scandinavia?
Yeah, we're working with a variety of cities already on this street one in Sweden. So it's Stockholm, but also Umeå in the north, which is smaller, and Helsingborg in the south. And that's partly just looking at different climate. Umeå is, can be -25 centigrade in winter. Helsingborg is more like a Copenhagen climate. It's close to Malmö, which is kind of wet and windy, but doesn't snow so much. And Västervik, which is only 25,000 people in the sort of middle of Sweden. They all have streets one way or another. They all have these same issues around mobility. They play out in different ways slightly. And that's why, again, we're looking at this very distributed model, decentralized model, really. So we're making a kit of parts, as you could probably tell from the drawings, that can be adopted and adapted. So if Umeå figures out it needs really super resilient snowy stuff, or a place for sleds to be docked, and Helsingborg, it's all e-scooters, that's fine, it's up to them. We hold the library like an open source library effectively and take their modifications in, but it's kind of decided by the residents themselves, or the inhabitants rather. So yeah, I think it should scale to anywhere with a street and a kind of a collision of shared interests, which is what streets are. It wouldn't have much use in a rural context particularly, but I think that's a different problem. So it's kind of, yeah, it's about the where systems come together, which is really where streets happen.
And myself, you, and Radha realized when we were getting to chatting before the talk that none of us had actually been to Columbus, Indiana. But can you imagine? We can imagine what a city like Columbus is like. It's supposed to be very nice cities. It's got a lot of modernist buildings, and it looks very green, and it's always in the top 15 or 20 places you should visit in America that are slightly off the beaten track. But America is a very different context in an urban situation. They have a different relationship with the cars. They tend to be more spread out. How applicable are these lessons that you've learned to American smaller cities?
Yeah, I think that, to be honest, I think they're super applicable, but there's only one way to find out. So that's to try it. But I did a workshop in Ann Arbor, Michigan in December, before we stopped moving around quite so much, with my old colleague Brian Boyer at the University of Michigan there, and testing similar ideas. We did this week-long studio working with architecture students about this kind of what I'd call like a small pieces, loosely joined design approach. And it was really instructive to see how naturally, of course, they take to it. I think it's something a little bit generational happening to some degree, but to them, this wasn't like a Scandinavian utopian idea or anything. I mean, this original stuff we're working on back in Melbourne, and Melbourne is fairly car obsessed, to put it that way. I mean, I'd argue Australia is pretty similar in terms of its relationship with the car, and therefore sprawl and low density environments and so on. So we've tested this in multiple places, and you can see cities all over the US shifting because of COVID again, taking the opportunity. I don't want to use that word in the context of COVID, of course, but the possibility of having the streets quieter and people beginning to modify them accordingly. So I don't think there's anything intrinsically, sort of deeply set here that couldn't be removed. I think deep down that humans are pretty convivial creatures, and that's a kind of the baseline there. Cars have kind of got in the way of that. And we've given the streets to traffic planners, and if you give the street to traffic planners, you get traffic one way or another. If you give the street to gardeners, you'd get gardens. So we're kind of just we're complicating it in a useful way by putting different people in charge of it. And so if people in Columbus use these approaches, I'm super intrigued to see what they come up with. But I bet it places a bet on humans and biodiversity over cars, actually, if you actually gave them a proper chance to shape their environment.
It's an interesting point that coronavirus has really changed the dynamic. Big cities, big dense cities are suddenly, possibly temporarily, but now seen as less desirable as more rural places, smaller places where you've got more space, less chance of coming into close contact with lots of people, more contact with nature. So do you think the balance is tipping in favor of middle cities because of a pandemic?
I think the pandemic probably accelerates things that were happening already. So it feels like it's more of a kind of accelerant than a precipitant, if you know what I mean. COVID, it's sort of the shift away from cars has been happening for a long time. So you look at the golden years it's a very 20th century thing, right? So people have been moving away from that for a while, and this has maybe put that on the table a bit sooner than some cities were expecting, and along with lots of other things like the shift to teleworking, or half the towers in Manhattan, in central Manhattan, had been half empty for 5 years before COVID hit. So there wasn't anything to do with COVID. There's sort of the problem with the business model of that kind of real estate, and then the problem of the impact on the city and inequality. All of those things were lying there already. So COVID's maybe pushed them up. Now Manhattan looks problematic in lots of ways. I think these things will rebalance a bit. I don't think Manhattan disappears. I don't think London disappears, or Berlin, or Tokyo. These things have been around for thousands of years, one way or another, in different ways, often. But I do think we'll see the steam coming out of the central, the idea of the single big city that dominates an entire region, whether it's the northeast of the US or the southeast of the UK. And I think we'll see a dissipation of that energy, which could be very interesting, because it might go to other neighborhoods in that city, which would be very interesting. So you don't have to travel to the CBD to do everything and then get back out again. You can stay in your neighborhood 3-4 days a week, and then maybe go to the center a couple of days a week. And then, those smaller cities and towns begin to emerge as something very viable indeed. If, again, we're capable of working from home, or a co-working space, or a library, or a community center a couple of days a week. And then you go to a kind of a CBD-like space for a couple of days a week as well. That's really plausible, it seems to me, and very powerful and far more sustainable. It totally destabilizes the entire real estate industry and a lot of the ancillary things. Because if you take 40% of the demand out of that business, in a business that was already not using its full capability, that's an extraordinary shock. So I think it could be a lot better for middle cities, for smaller cities, for neighborhoods within big cities, and a lot better all around if we rebalance these things, COVID or not. But that will be a shock across many industries in ways I wouldn't want to predict, but I think we're going to have to figure out.
And final question before we go across to Radha. I guess vested interests are all for disruption, as long as it's not their business model that's being disrupted. What we're seeing in London at the moment, I'm sure you've seen, is that councils have used the coronavirus pandemic as an opportunity to broaden pavements and to close streets by putting planters at the end of them, like you showed in the Melbourne example. But there's been a backlash, and people are vandalizing the planters and driving into them, and traffic in the outer circle of London, the sort of donut around the center where we have congestion charging. Outside that, traffic is like 50% higher than it was pre-COVID. So people are getting in their cars because they don't want to go on public transport, and then they're getting frustrated because the journey's taking longer, and then they're blaming people for putting flower beds in the street and getting very irate about it.
Yes. what can I say except yes, that is happening. So yeah.
What are we doing wrong, I suppose, is the question.
No, I mean, yeah, I think first of all, as far as we can tell, public transport isn't particularly a big spreader of COVID based on any data that's from Tokyo or France. We've seen that that's not the thing that spreads it. Massive misinformation given out about that early on, particularly in the UK, when I remember it was the environment minister said, a drive-in McDonald's is your best option right now. And I just thought, oh my God, this is the environment minister just giving, like in 4 words, the worst possible environmental advice, driving to a McDonald's. But anyway, I think this rebalancing. We have to do it very carefully, which is why I go back to this participative approach. I'm not one to tell a car driver to get out of their car and just take it away from them. That's really not going to work. We saw that the Gilets jaunes backlash in France a few years ago, and Macron just got the taxation ever so slightly wrong on petrol. So we have to work in a very, I think, empathetic way, in a very participative way. We also have to change. We have to move forward. There's no way that car driving around a city like London or any major city makes a ton of sense. I'm much more interested actually in something like Tokyo, which is a far bigger city, much bigger city, massively complex. But as you know, it's pervasive kind of subway connects you to what are basically 15-minute cities on walking and on bike, as per how Paris is trying to go. That's super scalable. I mean, if it can cover Tokyo, 25 million people, biggest urban region in the world, you can kind of make it happen at any one of the large cities. So that seems a problem London is going to have to work through, and we are going to have to change the way that congestion charge works and the way that high streets work, and those trends are coming for sure. So I don't think this is a case of resisting that. It's more a case of, okay, that's coming, so how do we do that? And that's why I go back to this very participative approach. We have to take people with us, because we don't have time for an endless back and forth of Gilets jaunes and then move forward and then protest and then move forward. It's just too much energy wasted. It'll take too long.
Thanks, Dan. Okay, Radha, sorry to keep you waiting so long.
Not a problem.
Did you finish your enormous mug of tea yet?
I think your prediction that it'll last me till tomorrow is going to come true, actually.
show us your mug.
Oh, sure. It's massive, about the size of my head.
We missed it because your screen's up, but maybe you can show it afterwards. Okay, let's get on with the presentation and we'll look at the mug later.
Sure. The important things. So the first thing that I will say is that I don't believe that technology is the answer to every challenge that we face in society. And I feel like I kind of have to make that disclaimer working for a technology company. But I do believe that advancements in technology will fundamentally shift the way that we think about, talk about, and actively engage in design and make practices. And we do need to be thinking critically about, how to adapt to such changes so that we don't get left behind, and that we don't have to then kind of simply just resign to the future happening to us. So, that's not working. There we go. Okay. So to just give you a sense of kind of where I'm coming from personally, I went from making buildings to building stories, and that has very much kind of shaped the way that I think about just design and think about the future in general. And at the core of both of these practices, I lead with this question, which is, who is this preferable for? Who am I leaving behind in this preferred future state? And while my work often focuses on more global context, because we are a global company, for the purpose of this discussion, I will kind of dive a little bit deeper into the US and more specifically into kind of the Midwest. So a significant portion of Autodesk's Foresight practice really speculates on our research around emerging technologies, on exploring that delta between where our core industries might be today and where our emerging signals are pointing us towards tomorrow. So these emerging technologies help us to kind of think more deeply about, for example, our relationship between with humans and robots through case studies like this with one of my colleagues, Evan. This is a digital twin VR experience exploring how robotics and immersive technologies might one day augment our workflows, leveraging automation, but also allowing for remote collaboration. or a robotically 3D printed pedestrian bridge, embedded with sensors with the intention of kind of feeding use information back to a digital twin so we can gain insights on design performance and really leverage that for the next time we build a pedestrian bridge or any bridge for that matter, potentially. So with Foresight, part of what we need to meditate on, though, is what isn't changing and how that can be leveraged as we move towards a preferable future. And so that's what we use stories to kind of unpack and to prototype in a safe, relatively risk-free space, is really thinking about what's changing, what isn't, and how might events, emerging technologies, and new roles really kind of intersect with and play out amongst existing infrastructure, existing context, and existing histories, which is a lot of what kind of Dan had spoken to earlier. And so last year we produced 4 speculative fictions, kind of speculating about 10 to 15 years out. I'm going to dive a little bit deeper into just one, which is about a fictional town located along what's sometimes referred to as the Rust Belt. And it explores one way forward for manufacturing in the Midwest. And it's modeled around a network of configurable microfactories dubbed the Rust Road Initiative. And while the future vision, does propose more shiny elements that we often do see in kind of speculations around the future, such as the implementation of smart infrastructure and the use of emerging technologies like robotics for construction, it does build on the rich manufacturing and design legacy of the Midwest. Because again, even if we're, positing about a potential future, it doesn't necessarily mean that we're starting with a blank slate. So at the heart of this is this provocation. As industries continue to move away from these models that require the ownership of products and towards models that require, that really kind of leverage and embrace the usership of services, the scenario asks, why not leverage a manufacturing as a service model? Corporations that had kind of historically begun divesting from smaller town operations wouldn't have to commit to a single site or town. And then for a fee, they would maybe have access to the entire Rust Road network. And as demand for particular products shifted, so could the nature of the manufacturing process be reconfigured to meet new demands more easily. And we kind of saw the friction in the system of a more kind of stagnant manufacturing network when during COVID times we had to, kind of reconfigure some manufacturing factories, and it took them maybe 30 days to get from car manufacturing to glass bottles or masks or defibrillators or whatever it was, right? Now, given the shock to the system that COVID-19 has kind of provided, there is also an opportunity to rethink patterns of urbanization. So imagine kind of a younger generation of workers, opting out of cramped city living and really settling back into these suburban and even rural towns that need that population boost, and more importantly, need consistent, vibrant civic engagement. And let's not forget, even in kind of a shinier future, we will still need human beings to build trust between humans and machines. I don't see a future where a human just opts into that relationship without feeling like someone else is holding their hand along the way. And I just want to kind of leave with these 3 final thoughts. This is how much has changed in the last week just in the Bay Area. And it kind of got me thinking about, the things that are changing. We're seeing more of a convergence of processes and industries and supply chains. And I kind of wonder how this notion of convergence might transform middle cities. What are those in-between spaces between industries, between design processes, between make processes that middle cities could really be able to leverage? We're also seeing this move towards, new models of learning and apprenticeship, such as micro-accreditation. And so I have been thinking a lot about a future of learning that might be less reliant on more traditional university scaffolding, and that could kind of open the door to new opportunities to attract residents to cities that don't necessarily have robust academic infrastructure in that way. And then, a more agile and localized supply chain. I think I got all the buzzwords in there. And this was, primarily a response to COVID's disruption to multinational businesses, but this could have longer term implications with the potential balkanization of data and digital infrastructure due to a more kind of multipolar political landscape. And so, could this maybe bring a push for these micro-circular economies in middle cities where they can be more self-sustaining, even if they can kind of, participate in a more national or global economy. They're not reliant purely on that. So, so that the future isn't homogenous. I think ultimately we have this opportunity, we really do, to shift the way we talk about, speculate on, and therefore design for the future. And that can only start by being more critically aware and contextually sensitive to the stories that we tell and the visions that we share about our preferable futures for communities and across regions. And that's just a little bit of what kind of I've been marinating on for the last few months.
Great, thanks very much. And show us the mug.
Sure. Oh yeah, important things.
That is a really big mug.
In my head. Gets me through most of my days.
So you mentioned at the beginning and at the end of your presentation this idea of who's this future for, and I guess that echoes what Dan was saying about you have to take people with you. You can't just take people's cars away and expect them to get over it. The whole concept of the Rust Road manufactory, is that a response to former industrial cities that still intrinsically feel that they should be making things? Is that if you were to go to a Midwest city that was once an industrial heartland and ask them what they wanted, would they say, we want to make things? And then is this response part of that?
I mean, I think what we were really thinking about is we can't just go in and say, here's this new thing, you guys now have to adopt it. So this becomes kind of that middle ground. How can we help to kind of move these cities into the future, but not do it in a way where we're asking for such an abrupt adoption of kind of a potential future? So let's start with what's there, and what's there is a rich legacy and tradition of making things and designing things. And so what could we do to kind of, take the infrastructure that already exists to kind of reconfigure it in a way that fits into a more forward, kind of more contemporary vision of the future, but not completely divest ourselves from, the stories, the histories, the skills, the legacy of the folks who have spent so much time in these cities, who have grown up in these cities, who have, built families in these cities, who have built community. Because I think to go in and say, here's this shiny future, if you don't follow it, you're not going to be successful, is to say, we're not listening to you and we don't care, And so to Dan's point, it really does start with the people. It starts with community, and it starts with that community engagement. And so this for us was that kind of stepping stone, that middle ground. How can we begin to kind of find a way in to build in some smart infrastructure to get folks engaged in new tools and technologies and new practices, but not do it in a way that's so jarring and so avoidant of what is already there and what we can also learn from.
I know this is going to sound like a very provocative question, and I guess it is a provocative question, but regions change. Global supply chains took a lot of the manufacturing away from certain cities. There's whole districts of the UK that were coal mining districts, and then the coal ran out, or the coal became uneconomic to exploit. That's the kind of, in a way, the whole history of civilization is ebb and flow of regions. Why should you try and give back to certain regions kind of a similar simulation of what they had before? Should we not just let it go in a kind of Darwinian way? These cities will come back some point as something else, but you just have to leave them be for now.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think part of it is we were really focusing on cities that had kind of felt like they'd been left behind, that weren't necessarily thriving in these new economies and in these new supply chains. And so in that kind of context, let's start with what is there. And we're not saying, hey, we want you to go make Ford Model Ts. We're saying, let's think about reconfigurable microfactories that can be more agile, that can really kind of keep up with the demand of having to, make more potentially consumer goods, more, mobile phones, whatever it is, and can really address the needs of a growing and changing population that will require new things in the future. I mean, we're not going to stop making things. We're not going to put people in boxes interacting with holograms. I think We will still need tangible products, and those products will need to be designed and made. And by no means am I saying, you know, these towns should only be thinking about manufacturing. Of course, I've seen some really wonderful examples of, you know, what we sometimes call like culture-led urban regeneration. And I've seen universities and museums and things like that kind of be the nucleus of these new redevelopment projects. But what we're saying is, for that to happen, the culture, the rituals, the behavior has to kind of come along with that. And if a town was historically a manufacturing town, and now you're telling folks, hey, we want you to value this other thing instead, and we're not going to listen to, you know, the 65-year-old or 70-year-old person who just wants to retire in the town they grew up in and worked in. What we're really presenting here is, again, like that bridging, but something to help that evolution a little bit smoothly and a little bit more successfully in a revamped way.
I guess what you were talking about with the Rust Road network is quite radical in a way, because you mentioned about culture-led regeneration. That's been very much the buzzword for decades now, hasn't it? The idea that people will come into cities or towns because of the lifestyle and the culture, and then they'll get work, and then the businesses and the industries will be, you know, service industries or technology-based industries where it doesn't really matter where you do the work, but the location is based on a lifestyle choice. You're saying that cities can regenerate through making stuff again, like they did a long time ago.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think again, you know, what we have to think about when we think about cities is they're incredibly complex systems. So there's no one solution. So what we were really looking at is, what if we kind of quiet the noise around some of these other things, for example, the culture-led kind of regeneration piece? And what if we just amplified a few weak signals around where the future of manufacturing might take us? And so that's kind of a blip in, you know, like a little microcosm of a broader future vision for where cities might go. You know, I don't think it's the end all be all kind of savior of the Midwest. I think it's a potential provocation for one consideration that should be made as we're thinking about this. And as we're thinking about being respectful and not kind of just taking a broad stroke brush and saying we're starting with a blank slate, because I don't think you can do that.
And if this idea was to take off, the Rust Road Manufacturing Network, what would be the driver? Would it be the civic leadership? Would it be the state government? Would it be entrepreneurs? Would it be cooperatives of people who worked at the factories that shut down before? Where would the spark and the drive come from?
I think it has to start with civic leadership, but it also has to engage the citizens of the city, the residents of that city, and there has to be consistent engagement throughout the process. And then it requires, you know, private organizations, students, entrepreneurs, all of those folks to kind of invest themselves. And I think something like this lends itself more to cities where you can have more of that consistent investment. You know, oftentimes we find in coastal cities, for example, in San Francisco, it's a very transient city. Folks maybe stay 2 to 3 years. I've been here for about 6. I don't know how, you know, but it's one of those cities where folks kind of move in and out, and that investment in the city isn't seen as widely. And of course, there are folks that are very invested in the well-being of the city, but I think with an initiative like that, you do need leadership to model that behavior, and then you do need residents to kind of buy into that, to see themselves in that vision of the future, to feel like they're being heard. And then funding has to come from you know, public and private entities.
Great, and I'd like to bring Dan back in now and ask this question to both of you. Dan, you were talking about mobility. Radha, you were talking about technologically driven manufacturing. What other futuristic modes, what other areas of activity are needed in cities to bring them back to life, or in towns to bring them back to life, besides manufacturing and mobility? What other lenses could we use to look at this problem, this situation?
I would say educate new models of learning, honestly. And I think oftentimes you know, people are drawn to cities because there are job opportunities or there's learning opportunities. And in those cities that can't necessarily provide either of those are the ones that are lagging behind. But what we are now finding, and what I'm really interested in, honestly, is as we move away from, you know, potentially from these more kind of formal systems of education towards things like, you know, one of the things we're looking at is micro-accreditation and kind of picking up new expertise through the use of the tools themselves. So you don't have to be a product designer to use Fusion, you use Fusion to become a product designer. And so that then lends itself to folks really being able to learn from anywhere. And if you can learn from anywhere, you can build skills from anywhere, I think that kind of empowers the individual to be able to be successful in any given future.
Yeah, I think I totally agree. I think learning would be one of the ones. It's alongside health. I mean, healthcare obviously is an enormous field for technology, but I'm particularly interested in preventative health promotion side of health as well. So not just the kind of medicine, the hospital end of it, but how do we really understand how living conditions, living environments, everything, employment contracts, all of those things, how they affect mental and physical well-being. That's enormous. And certainly in the context I'm in, where we have a big welfare state, an aging population, and we need to figure out how to make the healthcare sustainable, if nothing else. But it seems it's also the ethical thing to do, to build places that prevent people getting sick in the first place, make people healthy instead of unhealthy. That would be a huge driver, I think, alongside Radha's point about learning, for sure. These for me are then around, you know, sort of conviviality and social contact, diversity, interaction, migration, you know, how people come together in cities. These are, again, fundamental points, particularly biodiversity, and a huge swing in favor of that. And I'm in the sense of technology, I'm particularly struck by work by people like Julia Watson, her recent book, Low Tech, which was about nature-based technologies and indigenous understanding of what technology even is. So anything that repositions it like that for me, I'm sort of fascinated by, but particularly because of this emphasis on, let's say, these three big ticket items: climate resilience, public health, and social justice. You know, those are the three things driving us. And so if things kind of move in that direction, those are the most interesting ones, I think.
I mean, just to build on the health piece, I think we also have to be thinking about the future of food. Especially in cities and people's access to good and healthy food. Because I think that lends itself to, you know, higher or lower obesity rates, more resilient immune systems, better, you know, healthier children. And I think oftentimes the places that are, you know, kind of really struggling are the ones where a super Walmart is their only grocery store and it's 25 minutes away or 30 minutes away. So how can we kind of bring agriculture and food production back in a sustainable manner that really kind of helps to, you know, communities to kind of survive and to thrive?
Totally, and that's an excellent Midwest story, right? I mean, sort of in a place that's been an agricultural heartland as well as an industrial heartland. I'm thinking of Eric Kleinenberg's book on social infrastructure, and he talks about the grocery store and things like the Go Green project in Englewood in Chicago. Those are really, really inspirational projects, and they're very basic in a way, very humble approaches to tech, but there's also very complex tech you can do in that environment as well.
And I think that's why I say, like, you know, just coming from a technology company, I truly don't believe that technology is the answer to everything. And I think it is fundamentally addressing the immediate needs of people. And that's food, that's education, that's health, that's mobility, you know. And so how can we kind of take those building blocks and move forward with them?
Dan, you mentioned the 15-minute city, which has become actually a reality for lots of us since the pandemic struck. I mean, we've had to only walk 5, 10 or 15 minutes from our homes to find our food and so on and so forth. Unfortunately, the district I live in is perfect for that. But you're almost describing a small town, maybe a very small town, where you're actually 15 minutes away from the fields where the food is grown and from the farmer that grows the food. And so that it is, the pandemic is pointing us towards a small town paradigm in some ways. I haven't been in central London for months.
No, exactly, and I don't know whether you miss it or not, but it's bits of it you would miss for sure. But yeah, I think that's the thing. I said, you know, the pandemic has just sort of hastened some of these ideas. The 15-minute city was in Anne Hidalgo's plans last summer, you know, well before COVID hit. And of course, it builds on the way that cities have been for centuries. If you think about towns and cities up until about the middle of the 20th century. So it's only really 1 or 2 generations where we sort of forgot that. And I think we will look back on that as a kind of a weird blip where we just did it like that for a while. I think, you know, as you said, it's also just not just small town vision of the fields being 15 minutes away. It's also the food production coming into the city as well. And picking up on Radha's point about food, but the other mission we're working on in Sweden I didn't talk about is around school food, which is half of the meals served every day in Sweden, full stop. It's like 3 million meals a day. And we're exploring there, could you grow food on school grounds? I mean, schools are huge footprints and with roofs and the grounds around them. And how could you get the kids involved in growing the food and then picking the vegetables and sharing the menu design and use the waste in the food waste in the community around and so on. All of those things are technically possible and again, happened in the past. We sort of separated them all out when we started zoning things and splitting things into different silos. So I think, yeah, making things like, as Radha put, like learning and food and social contact central to our existence, that absolutely happens in the middle of Hackney as much as it does in Columbus, or as much as it does in a small town, or it could do, rather. I think that's the really powerful thing about the way that we can begin to make some of these things mobile. They're not as static as people think.
We've got some questions that have come in. One of them from Mimi Zeiger, who's one of the curators of Exhibit Columbus. So she says, we're talking about civic localities. I guess when we were talking about, you know, the 15-minute city, the mass of London suddenly becoming like a small town for me and my neighbors. Talking about civic localities, what do you see as relationships between middle cities? And I guess maybe she means, how do these different cities relate to each other in some kind of network? How do they work together? We've been talking about them for the last hour as if they're kind of isolated spots on the map, but of course they're not.
Shall I jump in, Radha?
Sure, go ahead.
I think picking up your point, actually, rather about making, something I was writing about recently or researching a bit was towns and cities like or Itala or Fiskars in Finland, where you have a company that's been making, in this case, cutlery and crockery there for hundreds of years. Or here in Sweden, we have a knife manufacturer called Mora Kniv, which is the town of Mora in Dalarna. It's been doing that for 300 or 400 centuries. Sorry, 300 or 400 years. And you have this long tradition of making there. They also, you know, it's handmade and robots at the same time. There's a complex supply chain network around it. It's not just the one town, it's multiple villages and towns. And of course, it's connected to other towns around it. It sells things through the middle of Stockholm in a concept store, and it sells things online as well. You know, all of those things are possible now from small town, middle town, large town environment, and they rely on really complex supply chains and networks. I think that's been a very powerful, and they're very resilient. I mean, they last hundreds and hundreds of years, and the wealth stays in those towns. And so the idea that, again, we need to move everybody to New York or move everybody to London is it seems to me, a recent kind of blip, to be honest. It's not that like that. And I was looking at Duflo and Banerjee, the Nobel Prize winning economists last year, who actually been out and interviewed thousands and thousands of people in towns and big cities. Very, very few of them want to move, actually. If they can stay where their family is and have meaningful pursuits there, whatever that is, that's what they want to do. And so it's only a few people in reality, and maybe we're part of the problem here, think that it's about moving to San Francisco or London or Stockholm in my case. Most people are perfectly happy in Mora or Fiskars or small town in the middle of Japan. If they have something to make, something to do in their culture and their family there, that's fantastic. So those things work in a network, absolutely. And that's a very powerful idea. You have this much more distributed networks model rather than just like the one big CBD. Far more resilient, I think.
Sorry, Dan, I didn't mean to interrupt. But I will say, I think that there is a flip side to this where we are seeing a younger generation of citizens really engage with their city and with other cities through more kind of robust digital infrastructure. And I think that we will, they're learning a lot. They're congregating in virtual environments, and I think that these new territories, new digital territories, kind of, virtual avatars of the cities themselves, I think will present a new space for exchange and that flow of knowledge and ideas that I think can be really interesting when we think about civic engagement and how we learn and evolve, as a network of kind of cities.
We've got two questions from Edbert Chang. I'll read them both out because they're kind of related in a way. How would you encourage young folks who move to the coasts for jobs and incentivize them to relocate to these Midwest cities, as you've just been talking about this time, so they can make these culture-based investments a reality? And then also, do you have any advice on bridging the cultural gap between blue-collar workers used to these older industrial models with urban professionals equipped with the robotics and fabrication know-how, which refers to this them and us, which lots of people are blaming for things like the Brexit vote and the Trump vote? People feel like they've been left behind, and certain cities, certain classes of people have been reaping all the benefits of the globalized world.
Yeah, I mean, I think, when we talk about automation, there is a story of people being left behind in that. And I think that is the grave reality of some of that discourse. But I also believe that we can't think about design and make processes without considering the deep legacy knowledge that people have had in the manufacturing industry, in design industries, in production industries. And so again, like I don't see a vision where all of a sudden we're just planting robots in the middle of America and saying, here, go, be free. I think that there is a place where we will still need those humans who, for example, have worked on the factory floor, who understand these robotic systems very deeply, who have that trust and that knowledge and that leadership on the factory floor. As we pull those off of the factory floor and onto like construction sites and things like that, those same people will still need to be there to help to build that trust, to help to kind of demonstrate the rituals, to help us to also understand how to better make sure that these machines, that human-machine relationship actually serves the needs of humans. And that human beings are at the center of that design process, and that they're speaking in a way that is decipherable to human beings that are working with them. And so we have this notion of what we call kind of cobot teams. And what that means is we're not talking about a robot future. We're talking about these collaborative teams of humans and machines. And so we're always going to see a place for humans in that future.
I love that cobot idea. I mean, it's I went to the Volkswagen factory at Wolfsburg a few years ago, the big one, like the kilometer square thing, and it was exactly that. It was kind of amazing. It was beautiful, actually. Sort of half robots, and then half of it was people. And the people, it was very quiet, very peaceful almost, and people were focused on their work and chatting and just wearing normal clothes. There wasn't like a factory you imagine in the past, full of noise and smoke and oil and grease. It was calm, and people were doing the stuff that the people can only do. The really fiddly bits of leather and the fascia inside the car. Robots are rubbish at that kind of thing. It's just the materials are too soft,
Yeah.
And the robots are doing the stuff that the robots can do. And it was really almost harmonious. You think this is like peak of that vision. And I think underneath that is this really big question, what are humans good at and what are robots good at? Or what's code good at, put it that way even. I remember thinking about Spotify and actually how that works a little bit like this, that I don't know if you ever use Spotify Discover Weekly playlist, and it seems to be remarkably good at heading songs in your direction that you might like. And it's based on people's individual playlists and the idiosyncrasy of that Radha might put 2 or 3 tracks, which mean only something to her next to each other. And they're crunched with yours, Marcus, and then they're crunched with mine. And so there's massive code kind of running over billions of playlists there, but they're made out of entirely human instincts about things that only Radha would know. And then it manages to pull out of that. That's why it gets it so good. Because it's this kind of, if you just got the code to do that, it wouldn't have the idiosyncrasy. It wouldn't have the unpredictability, the ambiguity, or the identity, all of those things. And equally, if it was just humans doing it, it's like a DJ on the radio. That's also great, but it's basically his or her view. So there's this really interesting synthesis about the cobot, which I think is really a huge question for us. And at core, it really asks us really sometimes uncomfortable questions. What is code good at? What are people good at? And that's something we really need to foreground, I think, as a question in so many different fields.
And just to build on that quickly, I think, you know, we're not still building houses with like nails and hammers, right? So like technology evolves, design and make practices evolve. And I think that's exactly the question we need to be asking ourselves, Dan, is what are humans good at and what are machines good at? And where are those opportunities to really build these, you know, synergistic relationships where we are thriving? I don't think that anyone wants to design a future where humans aren't thriving. And I think that's of course at the center of a lot of our provocations and our own questions to ourselves.
And it might be to the question you got, Marcus, about the blue collar, white collar thing, which that seems really old fashioned, doesn't it? The idea that we have white collars and blue collars, but most people these days are not wearing any collars. But anyway, you and I are, Marcus. Oh, we all three of us are wearing collars.
I've got a collar. Come on.
Yeah,
now.
I know you do. I just noticed exactly.
It's a bit camouflage here.
None of them are either blue or white, though, or maybe red.
Or white.
Yeah, exactly. I guess the thing is that it's the so-called white collar trades that are just as under threat, if not more. So the things like accountancy and legal profession, those are the things that code could eat up. Absolutely. Whereas, as I said, in the Volkswagen factory, the craft of making something, actually, that's really hard to do. Or, you know, in another context, a care worker dealing with an elderly person. Of course, a robot can do bits of that, as we see in places like, in cultures like Japan, that's happening. They're already a leading edge for that kind of work, which is fascinating. But there's a lot of it that just can't be done by code at all. And so in a way, it may be that some of those so-called blue-collar jobs are actually more resilient, anything more care-oriented, requiring empathy, delicacy, and all of those things. That's really hard to automate.
Yeah, maybe the media villages of certain parts of North London and Brooklyn, other kind of Rust Belt cities of the future, as all the creatives get poked aside by the robots. But you mentioned Julia Watson's low-tech book, Dan, which is sort of about how, you know, we could have, there's so much to learn from tapping into the residual knowledge of indigenous communities. Radha's presentation is about tapping into the residual knowledge of blue collar workers in quotes in sort of left behind industrial areas. This is leading into the last question from Aparna Pallad, which is about this whole idea of biodiversity. Like, what is there in nature that we've left behind and forgotten to ask about? Her question is, well, she starts off by saying, thank you for the incredible discussion. How can human-centered design support biodiversity? Humans having a symbiotic relationship with nature to be a key part was a key part in both the presentations, but why is it so important? I don't tend to techno-utopia or something, but I am genuinely curious. I guess she's, in a way, she's sort of saying, nature, so what? Like, convince me that it's important.
I think Julia Watson's book makes a pretty clear case as to what the what is around, you know, basically around not just our survival, but our enjoyment and culture and identity, all the thing that makes us what we are. And as a technology, I find it interesting. I think that's what her book's so interesting, just repositioning nature as a kind of infrastructure and technology. And it's so simple and clear, the powerful examples she uses, like the East Kolkata wetlands outside Kolkata, as this kind of amazing system that's been there hundreds of years, which is basically a large series of pools and trees and filters, processes almost all of the sewage over that side of the city, generates 156 tons of vegetables a day. You know, it's kind of, it does 700 million tons, I seem to remember, no, milliliters of sewage is translated into basically drinkable water or reusable water in some way, just using natural processes. There's something like 70,000 jobs involved and so on and so on. I mean, it's just off the scale in terms of benefit. And you compare that, or I compare that to something like the Gates Foundation's Toilet of the Future project, which is a great project. I have no problem with it, like go for it. But after hundreds of millions of dollars, there's something like the Yaniki bioenergy plant there. It does something like 17 gallons of water a day. You know, using a similar process. So all of this tech does one thing, which is turn dirty water into clean water at 17 gallons a day or something. East Calcutta does 700 million. And everything else, all the vegetables, all the jobs, the storm mitigation, you know, it protects that side of the city. So using nature in that sense, and I was doing that in the street earlier as well, using it, there are multiple co-benefits of those things. It's so powerful. It's far more powerful than, frankly, anything we've come up with. So it's not only the kind of thing we need around us to enable and generate life, it's possibly also the answer to some really key questions of water and energy and heat mitigation and all of the things that climate's throwing at us, public health, all of those questions. The answer to those may well be in nature-based solutions. We just need to see that they are a kind of technology and infrastructure and divert our brains in that direction as well.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Dan. And I think the one thing that I am often curious about, though, is, you know, a lot of the case studies we see of really successful kind of nature-led projects happen in areas where the environments are naturally quite lush, or the climates kind of lend themselves to, you know, to kind of that biodiversity expansion. And I think as we go into kind of, you know, more of the Midwest of the United States, where perhaps the climates are maybe a little bit more arid or don't necessarily lend themselves as much to kind of rehashing that natural ecosystem, that natural infrastructure, I think we have an opportunity to think about, like, what even is biodiversity in the future.
Totally.
Right. And if we think about nature or natural systems as a technology, what is the next generation of what that looks like in the context of these middle cities and these areas that maybe aren't, you know, tropical lush environments or coastal towns or near a river like the Mississippi or something?
Yeah, I think the thing in Julia's book, because she is Australian, actually, is interesting. She doesn't really use Australian indigenous examples, but that's the single longest running, most successful continuous culture on the planet until the English got there, basically.
That's true.
I mean, something like 40,000 years of continuous civilization, and in very arid conditions. I mean, the most arid in many places of Australia. So equally, I'm fascinated, but Julia doesn't cover it, and she doesn't really have much from the Sami in the north of Sweden, which is something I'm interested in. Like, how do you make it work when it's minus 30, minus 40? And people have done it for centuries and centuries. So we just have to kind of, I think, I completely take your point, Radha, and just say, use that as the input into a design brief and learn as much from those places as possible, because we've made a living everywhere on this planet, more or less, quite successfully until the last couple of hundred years. And then we've often really destabilized those systems.
Absolutely, and communities and civilizations have lived in mountainous regions and arid regions and things like that. But what I'm saying is, can we be more expansive and more broad about our definition of what even is biodiversity and what that looks like in a contemporary context? And I think that's where it becomes really interesting for us.
Well, thank you both so much. We've gone on way over time, but it's been fascinating. So I've been more than happy to let it run. Dan, Radha, thank you so much. And I suppose to summarize briefly, what we've been saying is that, you know, in order to make towns or cities better, look to what's already there: the infrastructural capital, the natural capital, and the human capital. A lot of the solutions are already in place. I'm just going to sign off by talking about the rest of the Exhibit Columbus program. There's another talk on Tuesday, the 29th of September at 7 p.m. UK time. This will talk about New Middle's resiliency and climate adaptation and how design can utilize responses to climate change, hosted by Exhibit Columbus curator Ika Gill. Designers Iñaki Alde and landscape architect Kate Orff will reflect on how their practices respond to local and planetary climate crises. The talk will focus on the Mississippi watershed and the ecosystems and habitats on its plain. And for details of all the other talks, because there are plenty of them taking part as part of this conversation, please visit the Exhibit Columbus website. Dan and Radka, thanks again. thanks once again very, very much. And see you soon.
Thank you. Thank you. Nice to see you.
Thank you.
Thank you.